Denise Stoner was herself a UFO investigator, serving as State Section Director and Chief Investigator for the Mutual UFO Network in Florida. This role placed her on the investigating side of the same phenomenon she says has followed her since early childhood. Her own accounts of repeated alien abduction, beginning at the age of 2.5 and continuing into adulthood, were documented by veteran researcher and author Kathleen Marden in her book The Alien Abduction Files, the most startling cases of human alien contact ever reported. Almost everything known about the case comes from Kathleen's investigation and from hypnotic regression sessions she conducted with Denise and her husband Ed. Hypnotic regression remains contested within the UFO research community, and Kathleen addresses that objection directly. She points to a criminal case from California in 1976 in which a bus carrying 27 students was hijacked and all on board were kidnapped and buried alive in the desert. The driver escaped and alerted the authorities to the location of the children. Placed under hypnotic regression afterwards, he recalled the number plates of the kidnappers' vehicles, and that information led to their arrest and imprisonment. In an online article published in 2016, Denise described her earliest memory of her abductions. She was 2.5 years old and at the family home in Hartford, West Virginia. Her mother was in hospital about to give birth to Denise's sister, and Denise was being cared for by her grandfather. She recalls looking out of a window, seeing an egg-shaped object, and asking her grandfather why Humpty Dumpty was in the sky. By her account, a look of fear came over his face as he saw it. He changed the subject and told her it was bedtime. Later, as she lay in bed, an entity walked through the wall of her room. Speaking to the Boston Globe, Denise described it as looking like a monk wearing a robe and carrying a light. The figure held out its hand. She felt no fear, took it, and they walked out into the hallway. The figure lifted the light, pointed it at the wall, then walked into the wall and disappeared. The next thing Denise knew, she was inside a large dome-shaped room surrounded by other children. She could not recall the content, but her impression was that they were being taught something. Her next memory is of waking in her own bed the following morning, with no recollection of entering or leaving the room. Denise states that since that night she has been taken by the same entity more than 50 times, from inside her home, while driving, and while walking along the street. Her description of the relationship is flat. There is no friendship, she says. He comes to get her, she knows she is going to be safe, and he oversees whatever is done. She has described him as a typical grey, though one of the tall ones. Other incidents followed soon after the first. Denise woke one night to find her baby sister was not in her crib, and this happened on several occasions. When her parents assumed the infant was climbing out and wandering downstairs, her father built a fence around the crib using plywood. Denise knew it would not work. She had watched the figure in the robe reach into the crib and take her sister. As her sister never came to any harm, she said nothing. In another incident, several years later, Denise suddenly realised that instead of being in her bed, she was in a nearby park. Behind her stood a tall, thin figure with a very large head. Attached to its arm was a device she compared to an oil can, with a tube dripping liquid toward the ground. She ran, and as she did so, she believed she saw the figure's arm extending towards her shoulder. By the time she reached the corner of the park, the figure was in pursuit. The tube reached her ear, and a drop of liquid fell inside it. A voice in her mind told her they would be able to keep track of her now as she got older. The incident that eventually brought the case to Kathleen Marden took place on the evening of the 13th of August 1982. Denise, Ed and their teenage daughter Deanna were living in Colorado and were driving to a weekend retreat at the Grace Acre Ranch outside Denver with the family dog. Denise's parents and a family friend had travelled ahead. The Stoners left Denver at around 5 p.m, taking the back roads to avoid rush hour, and expected to arrive at around 8:30 p.m. By 6:30 p.m, they reached the Kenosha Pass, where Ed pulled over to stretch his legs and take in the views over the South Park Valley. It was after he restarted the car that the evening changed. Deanna was asleep in the back as they passed through Jefferson, where Denise noticed 2 yellow-white lights in the sky, increasing in size and moving toward them until they sat directly over the vehicle. Without warning, the car moved sideways off the road and onto the desert floor, continuing alongside the road as though dragged by an invisible rope. Neither of them could prevent it. The lights remained overhead, and the next thing they were aware of was that they were out of the valley entirely, driving toward Trout Creek Pass. The sky was dark, and it was almost 11 p.m. Ed calculated they had covered almost 40 miles with no memory and lost close to 4 hours. Strangely, the trip odometer had not registered those miles. They reached the retreat 15 minutes before midnight, where Denise's parents were waiting at the roadside on the verge of filing a missing persons report. The Stoners decided to tell them exactly what had happened. Her parents at first assumed the couple were playing a prank on them and only gradually accepted that the account was serious. Denise would not speak publicly of it for almost 3 decades. By the time Kathleen met Denise, the family had moved to Florida, and Denise was working for MUFON. Consciously, all she could recall was being taken off the road into the desert with the light above them, and a figure of some kind standing near the car. She had undergone one previous regression years earlier with Denver hypnotherapist Dr. Romack, producing information about a black hole theory that made no sense to either of them. Romack had since passed away, and no records survived. The first session with Kathleen took place on the 7th of July 2011. Under hypnosis, Denise described 3 big lights coming down to the valley floor and said they did not look right because there were no roads out there. She described them as huge and bright white, rotating slowly and attached to another object she compared to 2 convex mirrors. As the car began to move sideways, she looked into the back seat where Deanna remained asleep. Denise's next recollection was of standing outside in the valley beneath what she calls the plates. The lights had separated and descended to the ground, and she understood she was supposed to go into the centre of them. A glob of clear, glowing, jelly-like substance floated toward her, roughly the size of 2 of her heads. Above it, she saw a black, obsidian-coloured opening shaped like an hourglass. She knew she had to step into the gel. She was afraid to, but stepped forward anyway. As soon as she did, she was sucked into it and described the sensation as breaking up, as though she was shattering. A voice in her mind assured her she would be all right. From inside the substance, she could see the opening of the ship and noted that it was too small to fit a human body through. A moment later, she heard a soft rushing sound and found herself inside the craft with no memory of passing through it. The gel was now gone, and she was standing in a brushed silver room, dimly lit but with no identifiable light source. Around the room stood several grey figures, motionless, staring straight ahead, and something in her mind told her these were soldiers. She described them as unclothed, under 5 feet tall, slightly more blue than grey, with no crease or line of separation in the skin, and large black eyes with a misty quality. A much taller figure then came around a curve in the room. Denise noticed its eyes blinked vertically. It bent until its face was almost touching hers, and told her they had to go in. She found this being considerably more disturbing than the others. Its head was not attached to its shoulders in the same way as a human's. Its eyes ran straight up and down near the sides of its face, and it had no nose and a tiny red mouth. It communicated without speaking aloud. Denise said she wanted to go back to the car, but the being told her she could not until it had done what it had to do. She became visibly anxious, and Kathleen ended the session there. The second took place on the 26th of October 2011. In the intervening period, Denise had consciously recovered further detail. The car had been lifted several feet off the ground when it moved sideways. They had passed a nearby ranch, and she was certain her husband, daughter and dog all remained inside the vehicle. She could not, however, recall how or why she got out of it. Under hypnosis, she recalled following the figure into an adjoining room where several similar entities were present. A mechanical male voice instructed her to get onto a table for a test. The figure tore the cuff from the right ankle of her jeans to place a thin wire on top of her foot, which stung and which she understood had been placed inside a vein. It would remain there a while, she was told, so that the ones on Earth would be able to recognize her easily. An instrument then placed something into her tear duct that felt like a grain of sand, and which she was told would fall out in a few days. She later described it as a tiny white bead, inserted with high-tech-looking steel pincers. The figure then pressed a diamond-shaped instrument down on her abdomen, and as it passed over her ovaries, it produced a burning sensation. Denise asked what the tests were for, and the reply came that it was not for her to know, and that she was part of the whole. She was also made to understand that the figure had visited her many times before. Kathleen considers the physical description Denise gave to be the most significant element of the case, corresponding not to a grey, but to what some researchers classify as an insectoid or praying mantis type being. Denise described striking yellow eyes with a black centre and lines running through them, 3 long fingers and 1 thumb on a very small palm, an oddly jointed body that appeared to be skin and bones with arthritic-looking joints, and bumpy greenish skin that felt rough. It wore a dark jacket reaching to its legs, with a stand-up collar of the kind worn by a priest. She sensed it could be controlling, mean and cruel, without any feeling about it. A third session on the 4th of November 2011 produced descriptions of the craft. Denise described a room with its own atmosphere that felt as though it wanted to spin without spinning, almost completely black, apart from a pole running from ceiling to floor. A mechanical device was wrapped around the pole with 2 arms extending from each side. Her account of it has no clear parallel in the wider literature. She said it was alive, that everything inside the centre block was in motion, that it could think, and that it operated the craft. She had been told it was capable of shielding itself and of passing through anything that flying through space can throw at it, that the technology had only recently been developed, and that this biological machine had brought the occupants here. 9 years later, on the 20th of October 1991, Denise and Ed experienced a second missing time episode in Florida. They had spent the day diving in a lake and returned to their motel, the Steamboat Dive-In, ate a dinner of fried chicken and went to bed. During the night, for reasons she could not explain, Denise dressed, went out to the vehicle and drove away. Under regression, she recalled pulling onto a small dirt road between two trees, where she saw an opening and an object she first took for a semi-truck with a tandem trailer or an unusually low water tower. At close range, it was neither. A ramp extended from the opening with a figure standing at the top of it, which she described as one of the strange ones with funny legs, and two small grey figures were moving towards her. Denise was removed from the car and taken up the ramp into a room containing nothing but an odd-looking chair. She felt dazed and dreamy. She was placed in the chair, and the figure took something attached to it that resembled a staple gun and pressed it against the side of her head. It felt, she said, as though he had stapled her. The greys returned her to her car. She then saw darkness broken only by a grey diamond-shaped craft with rounded ends and bright red lights at the left and right points, which began to spin faster and faster until it resembled a multifaceted crystal, then took off and disappeared. She could not recall the drive back, and only after climbing into bed did she realise the side of her head was bleeding. When Kathleen later examined it, she found a small staple-like scar exactly where Denise had described. The following morning, the Stoners set out for a final day of diving. Approaching a small farm, Denise pointed out several oddly shaped objects behind the barn, which appeared distinctly triangular with a net-like covering. Ed suggested chicken coops. Before they could stop, they found themselves approaching the interstate near Lake City, almost 30 miles away. Half an hour had passed, though to both of them it seemed instantaneous. They turned back, and when they passed the barn, the four objects were gone. Ed pulled over and told Denise it had just happened to them again, and that he had the same feeling running through him that he had felt 9 years earlier on the drive to the ranch in Colorado. Ed's own regression session produced considerably more. Everything had gone dark around them, as though they were inside a vacuum. He was still in the truck, but Denise was gone, and it was completely silent. A door then opened out of the blackness, revealing a tall, thin figure carrying Denise in its long, skinny arms, which brought her to the vehicle and, in his words, literally dropped her into the passenger seat. He noticed that its eyes were paler than its grey skin, and in a later letter to Kathleen specified that they were about 3 shades lighter than the body colour and not black as most reports describe. Denise's session covered the same interval from the other side. She recalled looking over to see Ed frozen at the steering wheel, then 2 grey figures approaching her as she floated in what felt like no gravity. Asked what had happened to the truck, she said they had sent it away somewhere, almost as though it had been placed in a weightless bubble and pushed away. Investigators have long noted that abductees are frequently taken while in the company of others who retain no memory of it. And Denise's description offers one proposed mechanism, though it remains her impression rather than established fact. She understood she was being taken a second time because of the thing in her head. The figure with funny legs examined the site where the device had been applied the previous evening, told her not to be afraid, and returned her. Like Ed, she noted the eyes were much lighter than most reports describe, and added that at close range they appeared to be made up of what she called jillions of little dots. Kathleen's assessment was that the 2 accounts conscious and regressed, were almost identical. She set the case against a questionnaire study of 50 people reporting similar experiences and found the pattern consistent. Abductions beginning in childhood and continuing at intervals into adulthood, events occurring in the company of a spouse who retained no memory but sensed something outside the norm, conscious recall of the beginning only, further fragments recovered in dreams, physical examinations, the sense that records were being kept, and the belief that the person was being tracked. Reported after effects were consistent as well, including electronic equipment malfunctioning in the days afterwards, shadowy figures, light orbs, unexplained noises, jewellery and household items going missing, and temporary psychic abilities. Kathleen recorded that Denise and Ed were honest, grounded, hard-working individuals, regarded by everyone who knew them as credible people of excellent character, who sought no publicity or payment and stood to lose established reputations by going on record. Her conclusion was that a district attorney evaluating the circumstantial evidence could feasibly prosecute on the basis that crimes had been committed against Denise Stoner, although the identity of such alleged perpetrators would make that impossible. Objections to the accounts of Denise and Ed are not trivial. Almost all the detail rests on hypnotic regression, a technique critics argue can generate or reshape memory, particularly where an extraterrestrial explanation is already expected, and Denise was at the time an active field investigator of abduction cases. Kathleen acknowledges that her professional familiarity with the literature may have coloured her recall. Against that sits the staple-like scar found where Denise said it would be, the odometer that failed to register 40 miles in 1982, and 2 people independently placing themselves 30 miles from where they had been seconds earlier. What was placed in her foot, her tear duct, and the side of her head, whether anything was ever taken back out, and what purpose is served by keeping records of a single person across a lifetime, are questions Kathleen Marden's investigation documented in detail but did not answer.